Shalom Uvracha, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Tzarich Iyun podcast, together with myself, Rabbis Pfeffer, and my esteemed colleague, Tzarich Adlerstein. And together today we're going to be speaking about the aftermath of the Gaza campaign, or war, as we like to call it here in Israel. That's really how we experienced it. And what we'd like to speak about is specifically the Jewish reaction. The Jewish reaction in America, the contrast with what's going on here in Israel, and how our opinion, our mindset concerning what's going on in Israel, our attitude toward Israel, which was so central concerning the reactions to the Gaza campaign, how that affects religion, how it affects our attitude towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how it affects our observance and our commitment to Torah and mitzvahs. And I think that this is a fascinating question, specifically when we think about diaspora Judaism, but also concerning us here in Israel. To what degree are these elements, are these ideas related? To what degree do they have to be related? And perhaps we can separate them out. Rabbi Adlerstein, how would you like to give us an opening on this topic?
Well, the most logical opening is that everybody out there should get themselves the ability to do a podcast, because it's great catharsis. And if there's a week where we need some catharsis, it was this. Just think of what we have lived through in the last week. And I'm not talking about the rockets and the cessation of the rockets and counting the casualties, Rahman al-Islam. We saw the end of a war. And we're not here to assess military objectives completed or not, but we saw very, very quickly the inability of the world to even pay lip service to the causes, the context for the little skirmish in Gaza. It's as if the world divided into people who could yet sense some kind of morality and judge both sides, and those who just reacted with groupthink that apparently is stronger than any of us believed. We watched as the pretense of we're not anti-Semites, we only hate Zionists, how that completely vanished in Los Angeles, in New York, in Berlin, in London especially, and lots of other cities that aren't being reported. I spoke to one of my kids yesterday, who lives in Las Vegas, and they for sure, laid back. Arizona almost went for Trump, and yet a guy walking around the strip for having a Magen David around his neck was assaulted. Now, he did not look exactly like an active member of IDF, but Jews are getting picked off because they are Jews. And then...
And I would say on your point, it's not even moral relativism, as if trying to find a moral perspective. Its morality is out the window. It's not even interesting. It's the Jews are bad, Israel is bad because Israel is strong, and the strong is always the evil and the wicked, and you're killing kids in Gaza, and therefore you need to be punished.
And we'll have to talk about this, but it looks from the outside like it's almost the difference between the notion that there is such a thing as an objective morality to throwing objective morality out of the window, and we'll talk about what it's being replaced. The last part is the paradox that it appears that some of our enemies have a greater clarity about what it means to be Jewish than a lot of Jews. They do sense that there's such a thing as an Am Yisrael, and Jews somehow being responsible for each other and sharing a bond. But the reaction of Jews was perhaps the hardest thing to take. 1,000 Jewish employees of Google split from the main Jewish internal organization to demand of Google that they issue a pro-Palestinian statement and cancel all contracts with Tzahal.
Which is incredible. And I think that's a very good entry into the kind of deeper elements of this discussion, because I would probably, don't take me up on this, but I would probably bet that not one of those Google employees that signed this petition against Israel was observant. mean, was a religious Jew. I would probably put money on that. And I think that's part of this big question. Meaning, in the past, when we think about, the generations that today are, let's say 60, 70 plus, there I don't think this divide was very prominent. If you're Jewish, whether you're observant or conservative, reform, or even not affiliated, I think Israel was generally, a Jewish person would be pro-Israel. And now it's become very much divided by religious affiliation. How do you think that came about?
That's the big question, and I don't think you can talk about it responsibly without making mention of the Pew Report, and to talk about, in particular, intermarriage, what it's meant in the United States, and the fact that 72% of those outside of Orthodoxy are now marrying out, and it's greater in other countries, combined with the fact that another poll showed, no, it was Pew itself, that in the youngest cohort that was mentioned, 18 to 29, only 34% of Jews in that cohort thought it very important that their grandchildren be Jewish. So we've seen somehow an erosion in an amorphous kind of Jewish identity. And that identity went through many different stages. The one who put it best was the Lubliner Rav. On the pasuk, "V'zacharti es brisi," etc. The af es brisi Yaakov, the af es brisi Yitzchak. I don't remember if there's another
Avram ve'aretz eskar.
The af es brisi Avram ve'aretz eskar. So the Lubliner Rav says that at one point the glue holding us all together was Torah. We fought about the nature of the Torah. We fought about whether Torah Shebaal Peh was valid, but everybody bought into Torah. And that eventually, in the time of Spinoza, maybe started fading. He said, but then you found another phenomenon, Jews who didn't see themselves as connected to Torah because they didn't believe it was the Dvar Hashem. They still were shul goers, maybe only Aliyah L'Rego, 2 days Rosh Hashanah and 1 day Yom Kippur. The Shalosh Regalim, but they built vast temples and Jewish centers, and that was Yitzchak, that was Avodah. When that failed, and by now the majority of people attending Reform temples are not halachically Jewish. Majority, that was owned up to by the Reform movement years ago. It still was chesed. People were there for each other. They funded and they founded and they funded Jewish hospitals, Jewish chesed organizations, immigrant help, and that started waning as well. And when that waned and you didn't have any of those connections, there was always V'ha'aretz eskar. And for a while we had the Holocaust, never again, don't give Hitler a posthumous victory. And there was Eretz Yisrael, but they both disappeared. Young Jews don't want to be reminded of the Holocaust. It makes them nervous. And they don't want to hear about Eretz Yisrael because they don't identify. And because it's a liability on campus. So when you have an absolute vacuum for people who are no different from other young people, wanting some kind of ideal, and not always being so sophisticated, they're listening to the talking heads on MSNBC and CNN, and worse, the professors in the colleges where they came from. And there we're seeing, which we did not see in 2013, we're seeing the bitter fruits of Marxist, I guess it's the best way of calling them, who put an ideology to what previously had been different groups with grievances, which other people often sympathized with. But what changed in the last couple of years, and what we're now seeing these people who are in positions of power in Silicon Valley, in corporate America, and certainly among the people working there, like we saw in the case of Google.
Right, and that ideology is anti-Israel by definition.
Anti-Israel because
and the Jews have to be a part of that. Because
simply a question of those with power against those without power. The
strong against the weak.
The weak.
The hegemony against the
minority. And we have
minority.
to change the entire system. And the only way to change the entire system is tearing it down and replacing it with something else. And people fought into that
from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. You say it with a wry smile, but it's this the tragedy of the situation. It brings me back to a lecture I once heard from Michael Oren when I was in New York, and he made this point. He said, if we want to preserve Jewish identity, then we need to preserve the support for Israel, because and I think that this is very much borne out, historically. Look at Israeli secular Jews who definitely care about what most of them will care strongly about what their grandchildren will be, whether they'll be Jewish or not, versus your Pew survey results for American non-affiliated Jews. And, the very fact that in Israel the situation is so different indicates the significance for identity with Israel, for Jewish identity. You have something that keeps you there. All of my friends, some of my friends who are more anti-Zionist, or at the very least non-Zionist, and they say, well, we would have been better off without Israel, and Israel has been a secularizing influence, and look at the Aldei Teiman and other really, unfortunate episodes that we can certainly clap al chet on. But if you look at the big picture, this is a tremendous difference, meaning Israel has not just been a secularizing influence, it's been an influence that kept people Jewish, at the very least, in the sense of having a Jewish identity and wishing their offspring and their grandchildren to remain Jewish. And at the time when Michael Oren was saying this, I raised my hand and I said, come on, why do you have to support Israel? You can support Yiddishkeit, you can support Torah, you can have a Jewish identity by being a part of Am Yisrael, irrespective of your Zionist leanings or otherwise. But I see that he had a point.
He had a point, but I wonder if that too has shifted somewhat. The silver lining on the terrible cloud of Meron was the reaction of Israelis. Now, often people say, if only we could show achdus like we do in times of war. This was not a time of war. There was no external enemy that caused that tragedy. There were people who died. There were lots of 150 people who were injured. And you had in the next days such an outpouring of sympathy and help. When people lined up for an hour and a half under the sun in Tel Aviv to give blood to the one group they probably would have said they had least shaykhus to, least connection with in Israel, you saw a residual Jewish family. Maybe people couldn't even define it, but this is a place where it's not just uniting against the common enemy. You feel a sense of family, of we are a nation, and this is something great. And Americans don't have that anymore. And a lot of Brits don't have it, and the French don't have it, and the Germans certainly don't have it.
You think so? Even though in times of tragedy, you often find even humanitarian aid internationally and so on. I'm not sure how much you can judge by times of tragedy. Look at how much we're busy fighting now in the post-Meron, in the aftermath, about how this should be investigated, and the political different weavings and maneuverings of different sects. Meaning, it's not so simple to derive, a kind of a general mindset from reactions to tragedies. But certainly, I think, let me give you an example of this correlation between Israel and Emunah. I have a friend, a Satmar Chassid, once came to him and said, listen, I'm going through a crisis in Emunah. My friend is very involved in Yonah Emunah, in Kiruv, in different parts of a world of thinking about Emunah, thinking about what we are. And he came to him and he said, I'm going through a crisis. So you're sitting on in a house in Jerusalem with a view similar to this. And he said, listen, if you would have come to me 70 years ago, 80 years ago, and told me you have a crisis in Emunah, I would say, you know what? Tough. It's a good question. But look out the window. Look at what you see around. Yerushalayim HaBnuya. You see what HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done for us up until this day. Where we've come over the last few decades. It's hard to have a crisis in Emunah nowadays. Look at where we've come to. And you know what his reaction was, the Satmar Chassid? Satmar Chassid said, no, that's a Maisa Satan. That's not a Kodesh Baruch Hu, that's a Maisa Satan. There's no Emunah going on here. Meaning, ultimately, you mentioned, right, what did HaKadosh Baruch Hu promise Avraham Avinu? He promised him the land. He promised him, and I don't mean this now in a mystical sense. I mean it in the sense of, yes, having a land and having an identity that's around a national identity with a homeland, with a territory, is a very strong binding force. If you don't have that, then you can really, you stand to be very vulnerable in terms of getting lost.
So I'm going to meet you halfway, which is better than we often do, and say that really the two positions can and should be combined. There is this magic of a Jewish family. It's experienced in strong Jewish communities. Part of community is a tie to land, and part of it is a tie to culture. And in our case, the most important ingredient is Torah itself. Now, I think that putting all of this stuff together, there's a lot to talk about, but one immediate takeaway is where we should be committing money, energy, in investing in the future of Klal Yisrael, other than the needs that we know about. Ron Dermer scandalized the country last week when he said, when he was asked about Hasbara and how it's failing, and he said, you know what? I think we're misdirected. Jews in America amount to, it's really 2.5% of the population, I think. He's a lower figure. And a huge number of them are no longer committed. Baruch Hashem, a huge number still are, and they're still wonderful, wonderful young people. And we got to do our best to keep them strong. But we've lost the majority. The dream of the Kiruv movement in its inception, that if we all put a little bit more money and energy, every Jew will come back. Almost every Jew will come back. That didn't pan out. We've had to retool. So Ron Dermer said, investing lots and lots of money in Jews makes less sense than investing in the 25% of Americans who call themselves evangelical Christians, who have been, till recently, have been terrific. And still, in the last week, the strongest messages were coming from them. What's happening to the young people is something else. But what this suggests is that for those of us who are not telling the Israeli government how to spend money, but who are interested in strategically helping the Jewish people, we've got to look for models, first of all, of strengthening those communities in Chutz La'aretz that are vibrant communities, not coming up with new schemes that may or may not work.
Bring in the distance, right?
And we have to, the kiruv is going to come from people experience both sides of this. They'll experience Jewish family in Jewish homes, in Jewish communities, and from there they will learn Torah Yisrael also. But the best kiruv tool, they used to say, I think it was the Kleisenberg who said, was sit down with a Yid and give him a glazel tea. And then it got refined a little bit more that the single most potent weapon in the tshuva arsenal was cholent. And I don't know what we did with vegetarians.
It's very interesting. I'm a Talmud of Rav Moshe Shapira. And Rav Moshe's approach was very much a Torah approach. He said the most potent weapon is a sefer. You open up, you start learning. You learn with a hug. You learn with a good cup of coffee. But learning is the most potent weapon. And it's interesting to think about this. I found in kiruv organizations over the years that they've gravitated from a place of let's learn, and that will bring them back to observance, to Torah and mitzvahs. Let's learn to keep them connected. It's hard for me to say it because yes, obviously we care so much about Torah, about mitzvahs, but our discussion today is just being connected. And what you're saying is one channel. There's a channel of the textual, be connected to your texts, be connected to your nation, Be connected to your family, yes, to a sense of community, but just be connected. And then when the channel is there, then who knows what can go into that channel, but just make sure that channel is open. But what you're describing is a situation where vast percentages just don't have any more channels.
They don't read anything, let alone are interested in sitting down for half an hour and read words of Torah. I was firmly on that side for most of my early career in Kiruv. And I still believe it. It's what I do best. I find a hard time doing the other stuff. But I have to recognize that the successful models of recent times have been, please don't throw me over the railing, no one succeeded like Chabad. They're not in the big cities like most of the Kiruv effort is. They go into a community, they say, we're here, we're not leaving in 5 years, we're here for life. Open a center, one by one bring people in, and they cater to them as family. We're interested in your lives, in your children. And from there, inevitably they pick up. We can debate whether they should be using this safer or that safer and what the message is, but let's face it. The greatest percentage of that message still is there's a Ribono Shalom, and he gave us a Torah, and we're an Am Yisrael because of it. And they have now, in their rural communities, the best way of keeping Jews connected. And ultimately, those are the people who will be the ones, the fraction of them who will be interested and go on further will be the ones.
Fair enough. And just to note, the Chabad themselves have this very challenging relationship with Israel and with Zionism and so on. And exactly because of this, because they appreciate that keeping people connected and channeled and with some element of Jewish identity is related to Israel in some way, while at the same time they have a long history of being anti-Zionist. The Rebbe himself was more nuanced about this. His shver, his father-in-law, was he was a super anti-Zionist. So this. What would you say for us, though? Okay, we're sitting here in Yerushalayim with a beautiful view. We have our community, we have our Baruch Hashem, our engagement with Torah. What can we do?
The first step is imagining ourselves back in high school and listening to what our Rebbeim were saying. Some of those messages, I don't know where you went, you might know where I went, but it seemed when I was a kid listening to old timers from Europe, survivors, and it was high in the sky. It wasn't really talking to us. We were from kids, so we stuck with it and we got more sophisticated. But some of the just basic issues of Emunah, that if you don't have Emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there is no possibility of a working sense of morality. The Malbim on Avram and Avimelech. Avimelech says, "What did you do? What did you do? Why have you treated us this way?" And Avram says, "I saw in Yerushalayim kid Mokamazeh." And he says, "Well, what do you mean? What have I done? We haven't mistreated you. We're a civilized country here. We have our own mores. We're not into your religion." So the Malbim says Avram's response to him was, any system of morality that does not have at its core a responsibility to a borei olam is not worthwhile trusting. Any kind of trust we could have had in other systems has totally failed us. It failed us in the Holocaust. Maybe we need a reminder every 75 years. But to see the reaction of the world in this past week, and to see that those people who we don't believe about, we have to say serious theological differences is an understatement. But there is a core of believing that there is a Ribono Shalom who speaks to man, and that there are things that don't change. And they said, "What? How could you not even mention a country? Mention 4,300 rockets being sent it to civilians?" And
it's a good point. Let me make a short comment on that, because I think it's very interesting. We started by saying, listen, in order to keep a strong Jewish identity, Israel is an important factor in terms of Jewish nationalism, Jewish belonging, being a part of the nation, a part of the family, and so on. But your point now is the opposite. Israel needs people to be frum. Israel needs people to be, at the very least, believing, at the very least, to have this moral center of having a Kadosh Baruch Hu in their lives. Because without that, Israel loses its own support, its own base within Jewish support, and the more so support around the world. If you don't have religion, if you don't have the one God, which is the one moral God, the one good God, this what they call moral monotheism, which for me is the definition of, one God. It doesn't mean one as opposed to numerous, but it's a different kind. If you don't have that basic emunah, that basic, grounding, then you don't have the morality that will be able to give Israel the support it so needs. I mean, this is exactly what we're seeing being played out, and I think that the correlation, in Israel, yes, you want your grandchildren to be Jewish, and you yourself are going to have, a certain hakpada, a certain care and concern, to make sure that you do whatever you do, a bris milah, a bar mitzvah, weddings, and so on. Halavai, this needs strengthening. I'm not saying the situation here is wonderful, but it's better than it is in the States.
The only thing I would add to that is that I implore people to not just pat themselves on the back and say, it's great that we're ma'aminim and we need more emunah, but to recognize that this emunah that we're talking about, as particularistic as it is in the way we live it and we have emunah in it, there's a universal element of it that the world is crying out for. And that makes an afkamina in the way...
Is the world crying out for it, Rabbi Yitzchak?
The world is crying out for it. It's not the whole world. I'm not going to give you numbers. Is it in the hundreds of millions? Yes, it's in hundreds of millions. That's enough work out there to make very important friends for Israel. Besides, possibly this is what the Ribono Shel Olam wants us to be doing. It makes a difference in the way we speak to a totally secular Jew in the street, to emphasize what it is that is common to us without pushing observance or hitting him over the head with things that he's not ready for. It makes an afkamina in speaking to people outside of this country, to speaking to our friends and even to the people who are caught in the middle. There is a thirst out there for people who watch the anchors of their whole moral life being completely cut out from under them and wanting something. So they're not going to become Jews. They're not going to convert. But can they hear in us a passion, a sincerity, and a connection to the Ribono Shel Olam and what it's all meant? And what it's all meant. Practiced in different ways, but what's at the core of it? There are hundreds of millions of people who are receptive to that. And this is a question not only of kiruv and of being a different form of Einei Hagayim, but it's also vital to the survival of the state.
The Gemara says, I'll finish off with this maybe, that Gemara says, Shia Shem Shamayim Shagur Al Picha, that the name of God should be always on our lips. And sometimes we do it just because of rote. We say, how are you? Okay, Baruch Hashem. But what you're saying really inspires me to think about, when I'm speaking, when I'm giving a lecture, when I'm even speaking about some mundane issue or speaking about Israel and so on, make sure you bring God into the picture. Bring our basic emunah, bring our basic belief that what's going on here is part of Hashgacha, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is leading something, and that it's relevant, and that it behooves us, it makes us duty-bound, not just to appreciate that, but also to a system of good, to a system of morality, which is what he wants from us.
This I think is what the Balei Musar say was behind the takana of Hashem Imachem.
Hashem Imachem, right?
That you bring in Boaz's takana. I just read it. That was a mind-blowing new takana. It was the idea of that the Shem Hashem is Shogor B'ficha, and you mean it, and you bring it into daily conversation.
Yeah. All right. Bracha is also, that's for us, for another time. We'll finish off there. I want to thank all of our wonderful technicians, Aaron Zeidman especially, for really enabling this podcast to be broadcast to everyone. Thank you to Rav Yitzchak. Thank you to the platform we have here at Tzarich Iyun and the Tikva Fund. And thank you to you, to all the listeners and to the viewers. We'll see you, please God. And we're bringing in a Kodesh Baruch Hu here with the help of God. We'll see you next time round.